In the twilight years of Imperial China, behind the vermilion walls of the Forbidden City, a love story unfolded that would become one of history's most tragic romances. This is the story of Pu Yi, the last emperor of China, and Wan Rong, the beautiful woman who would become his empress and share in the spectacular rise and devastating fall of the oldest continuous monarchy on earth. Our story begins on a cold February morning in 1906, when a 2-year-old boy named Pu Yi was wrenched from his mother's arms and carried into the Forbidden City. The Empress Dowager Cixi, the formidable woman who had ruled China from behind the throne for nearly half a century, was dying. She had chosen this child, her grandnephew, to be the next emperor. The boy screamed and fought against the eunuchs who carried him, calling desperately for his mother. He had no understanding that his childhood had just ended, that he would never again live as an ordinary child. Within days, both the Empress Dowager and the previous emperor were dead. At just 3 years old, Pu Yi ascended the dragon throne as the Xiantong Emperor, the last in a line stretching back thousands of years. He sat on a throne too large for his small body, surrounded by officials bowing and prostrating themselves before him. The child emperor wept, terrified by the ceremonies he couldn't understand, while outside the Forbidden City, the ancient empire was already beginning to crumble. Pu Yi grew up in a golden cage, served by 1,500 eunuchs who treated him as a living god. He was told the entire world belonged to him, yet he was forbidden from leaving the palace walls. He had every luxury imaginable, but no freedom, no friends his own age, no understanding of the world beyond the Forbidden City. The eunuchs indulged his every whim, teaching him that he was above all laws and customs. When he ordered them to be beaten for minor infractions, they obeyed without question. When he destroyed precious artifacts in fits of rage, no one dared stop him. He was becoming a tyrant before he learned to read. But in 1911, when Pu Yi was just 6 years old, revolution erupted across China. The imperial system that had endured for millennia was swept away in months of bloody fighting. General Yuan Shikai negotiated a deal with the revolutionaries and the imperial court. The emperor would abdicate, but he would be allowed to keep his title and continue living in the Forbidden City with an annual stipend of 4 million silver dollars. The outside world called it the Articles of Favorable Treatment. Inside the palace, they pretended nothing had changed. Young Pu Yi was told he had abdicated, but the word meant nothing to him. Within the high walls of the Forbidden City, he was still treated as emperor. The contradiction would haunt him for the rest of his life. Was he an emperor or just a child playing dress-up in ancient robes? The question tormented him as he grew older, trapped between two worlds, belonging fully to neither. As Pu Yi entered adolescence in the early 1920s, the question of marriage became urgent. He was 17 years old, shy and awkward around women, having spent his entire life surrounded only by eunuchs and elderly officials. His education had been classical and completely divorced from reality. He could recite ancient texts but knew nothing of the modern world. He had never walked on a city street, never handled money, never made a decision for himself. And now, this sheltered young man was expected to choose a wife. The selection process was medieval. From across China, families sent photographs of their daughters, hoping to marry into the imperial family even though the empire no longer existed. Hundreds of images arrived, each showing a young woman in formal dress, her face carefully prepared for the camera. Pu Yi was supposed to choose from these photographs alone, selecting the person who would share his strange half-life in the palace. Among the photographs, one face captivated him. She was beautiful in a delicate, ethereal way, with fine features and intelligent eyes that seemed to look right through the camera. Her name was Wan Rong, and she came from a prestigious Manchu family with a long history of service to the Qing Dynasty. But there was something else in her photograph that drew Pu Yi's attention. Unlike the other candidates who stared blankly at the camera with traditional reserve, Wan Rong had a hint of something in her expression, perhaps curiosity, perhaps a spark of personality that hadn't been completely suppressed by traditional upbringing. Wan Rong was 16 years old when her photograph was sent to the Forbidden City. She had been raised in Beijing in a wealthy family that embraced both traditional Chinese values and modern education. Unlike most girls of her generation, she could read and write English. She played the piano. She loved Western films and fashion. She was intelligent, cultured, and utterly unprepared for what awaited her. When Wan Rong learned she had been chosen to be empress, her feelings were complex. On one hand, it was the highest honor imaginable for a Manchu girl. On the other hand, she was modern enough to understand that she was being married to a title that no longer held real power, to a young man she had never met, and would be imprisoned in the Forbidden City for the rest of her life. Her family was ecstatic. Wan Rong herself seemed caught between duty and dread. The wedding took place on December 1st, 1922, with ceremonies that hadn't changed in centuries. Wan Rong was carried to the Forbidden City in an elaborate sedan chair, wearing layers of heavy embroidered silk that weighed so much she could barely walk. She hadn't seen Puyi's face, only his photograph. When the ceremonial veils were finally lifted and they looked at each other for the first time, two frightened teenagers stared back, both realizing they were now bound together in this strange, anachronistic existence. In those early days, there was genuine affection between them. Puyi was shy and awkward, but he was drawn to Wan Rong's beauty and her educated mind. She could speak to him about things beyond the palace walls, about books and music and the modern world he had never experienced. For Wan Rong, Puyi represented security and status, even if his empire was gone. She hoped she might find companionship, perhaps even love. They spent their days in the vast palace, wandering through halls filled with treasures accumulated over centuries. Puyi showed her his favorite places, the gardens where he had played as a child, the libraries filled with ancient scrolls. They were like children playing house in a museum, pretending to be emperor and empress in a world that had moved on without them. Sometimes they would sit together while Wan Rong played Western music on the piano, the modern melodies echoing strangely through the ancient halls. But the Forbidden City was not a place conducive to love. Thousands of eunuchs watched their every move. Court protocol governed every interaction between them. They couldn't simply be a young married couple learning to know each other. Every meal, every conversation, every moment of their day was choreographed according to rules established centuries before they were born. The weight of tradition pressed down on any spontaneous feeling between them. And there were tensions from the beginning. Puyi had also been required to take a secondary consort, a girl named Wan Rong. The tradition of imperial concubines was deeply embedded in palace culture, but for Wan Rong, educated in modern ideas, sharing her husband with another woman was humiliating. She hid her feelings behind the mask of an empress, but the hurt was real. Puyi, for his part, seemed to regard both women more as obligations than as partners. He had been raised to see himself as the center of the universe, and genuine intimacy was nearly impossible for him. As months turned into years, the relationship between Puyi and Wan Rong began to sour. The initial attraction faded under the strain of their impossible situation. They were prisoners together in the Forbidden City, growing increasingly frustrated with their meaningless existence. Outside, China was transforming. Warlords fought for control of the country. New ideas about democracy and communism swept through the population. Inside the palace walls, time seemed frozen. Wan Rong particularly struggled with the confinement. She had tasted modern life before entering the palace, and now she was trapped in what felt like a previous century. She began to slip into long periods of melancholy, spending days alone in her chambers. The eunuchs whispered that she was becoming erratic, that she would fly into sudden rages or weep for no apparent reason. Puyi, self-absorbed and immature, didn't know how to help her or even recognize that she needed help. Then, in 1924, everything changed. A warlord named Feng Yuxiang seized control of Beijing. Unlike previous power holders who had maintained the fiction of the imperial household, Feng had no use for old traditions. On November 5th, his soldiers marched into the Forbidden City. They gave Puyi and his family 3 hours to leave. 3 hours to abandon the palace that had been a center of Chinese imperial power for 500 years. The expulsion was chaotic and humiliating. Centuries of treasures were hastily packed or simply left behind. Pu Yi and Wan Rong, who had never left the palace as adults, were suddenly thrust into the modern world they barely understood. They fled to Pu Yi's father's house, carrying what belongings they could. For the first time in her married life, Wan Rong was free from the Forbidden City. But it didn't feel like freedom. It felt like exile. They lived for a time in the Japanese concession in Tianjin under the protection of Japan. This should have been a new beginning, a chance to build a real life together outside the suffocating protocols of the palace. Pu Yi could have gotten education, found meaningful work, built a modern marriage with Wan Rong. But he couldn't let go of his imperial identity. He surrounded himself with former officials who fed his delusions of restoration. He spent his days planning impossible schemes to reclaim his throne while Japan watched with interest, already plotting how they might use this former emperor for their own purposes. Wan Rong flourished briefly in Tianjin. She could wear Western clothes, go shopping, see movies. She made friends with other women. She had glimpses of the life she might have had if she hadn't been chosen to be empress. But Pu Yi resented her independence. When she expressed opinions about his restoration plans or criticized his advisors, he would fly into rages. The affection that had existed between them in the early days was completely gone now, replaced by mutual resentment and disappointment. In 1931, Japan invaded Manchuria, the northeastern region of China that was the ancestral homeland of the Manchu people. The Japanese military had a plan. They would create a puppet state called Manchukuo and install Pu Yi as its ruler. They painted it as a restoration of his rightful throne. In reality, they were offering him a chance to be a figurehead emperor of a Japanese colony. Pu Yi was warned by nearly everyone around him not to trust the Japanese. Chinese officials told him he would be seen as a traitor. Foreign diplomats told him the Japanese were using him. Even some of his own advisors urged caution. But Pu Yi was desperate to be emperor again, to matter in some way. Against all advice, he accepted the Japanese offer. Wan Rong begged him not to go. She could see more clearly than he could that this was a trap, that the Japanese had no intention of giving him real power. They argued bitterly. Pu Yi accused her of not understanding his destiny, of not supporting him as a wife should. Wan Rong accused him of being a fool, of choosing empty titles over their safety and dignity. But in the end, Pu Yi made the decision. In November 1931, he secretly left Tianjin for Manchuria. Wan Rong, as his empress, had no choice but to follow. The journey to Manchuria was Wan Rong's point of no return. She left behind the comfortable life in Tianjin, the friends she had made, the small freedoms she had enjoyed. She traveled north to a harsh climate and an uncertain future, following a husband she no longer loved, to become empress of a country that existed only as a Japanese fiction. Manchukuo was proclaimed in March 1932, with Pu Yi as its chief executive. 2 years later, he was officially made emperor of this puppet state. The Japanese staged elaborate ceremonies to give the regime legitimacy, but it fooled no one. The real power was held by Japanese officials. Every decision Pu Yi made had to be approved by his Japanese handlers. He was emperor in name only, a propaganda tool for Japan's imperial ambitions. For Wan Rong, Manchukuo was hell. They lived in the capital city of Chongqing in a palace that was really just a large compound surrounded by Japanese guards. She was empress of nothing, married to a man who had become a collaborator with her country's invaders. The Chinese people viewed Pu Yi as a traitor, and by extension, she was a traitor too. She was trapped once again, but this time there was no pretense of grandeur, no centuries of tradition to give meaning to her imprisonment. Her relationship with Pu Yi deteriorated completely. They barely spoke except to argue. Pu Yi blamed her for not giving him an heir, though many believe he was incapable of fathering children due to psychological issues stemming from his isolated upbringing. The lack of an heir was a source of constant humiliation for both of them. Wan Rong felt she had failed in the one role that gave her any value in Puyi's eyes. Isolated and miserable, Wan Rong began to seek escape in any way she could find. She started smoking opium, a habit that quickly became an addiction. The drug offered temporary relief from the crushing reality of her life. Puyi, rather than helping her, seemed to encourage the addiction. A drugged empress was easier to control, less likely to cause problems for him with his Japanese masters. Then Wan Rong did something that would seal her tragic fate. Whether out of loneliness, rebellion, or a desperate need for human connection, she began an affair with a chauffeur named Li Tiu. In the stifling atmosphere of the Manchukuo court, where she was constantly watched and had no real friends or allies, this man had shown her kindness. The affair was brief and furtive, conducted in secret in a palace where there were no real secrets. In 1935, Wan Rong became pregnant. The news should have been celebrated, the emperor finally getting his heir. But Puyi knew the child couldn't be his. They hadn't been intimate in years. The pregnancy exposed Wan Rong's infidelity and humiliated Puyi before the entire court. His reaction was swift and cruel. When Wan Rong gave birth to a daughter in 1935, Puyi ordered the baby taken away immediately. What happened to that infant remains one of the darkest mysteries of this story. Some accounts say the baby was killed right away, smothered or poisoned on Puyi's orders. Others say she was abandoned in the winter cold to die of exposure. One version claims she was given away to a peasant family. Whatever the truth, Wan Rong never saw her child again after the first moments of her birth. The loss destroyed what remained of Wan Rong's sanity. She had already been fragile, already suffering from depression and drug addiction. The forced separation from her baby pushed her over an edge from which she would never recover. She became a ghost in the palace, wandering the halls in a drug-induced haze, sometimes screaming for her lost child, sometimes catatonic with grief. He showed no mercy. He had Wan Rong effectively imprisoned in her own quarters, kept drugged and isolated. The beautiful, educated young woman who had once played piano and dreamed of modern life was reduced to a hollow shell. The Japanese officials who controlled Manchukuo didn't care what happened to her. She was irrelevant to their purposes. She could rot in her rooms as long as she didn't cause a scandal. For nearly 10 years, Wan Rong existed in this nightmarish state. Outside, World War II raged. Japan's empire expanded and then began to collapse under the weight of its own ambitions. Inside the palace in Changchun, time seemed to have stopped. Wan Rong lived in a fog of opium and misery, a prisoner of her husband, her circumstances, and her broken mind. In August 1945, Japan surrendered. The emperor they had installed in Manchukuo was suddenly a liability. Puyi and his household fled as Soviet troops advanced into Manchuria. The retreat was chaotic. Puyi, thinking only of himself, tried to escape to Japan. He was captured by Soviet forces and would spend the next 5 years in a Soviet prison camp before being handed over to the new communist government of China. Wan Rong's fate was even worse. In the confusion of the flight from Changchun, she was separated from the main group. Sick, addicted to opium, and completely dependent on others for survival, she found herself in the hands of Chinese communist forces. They had no idea at first who she was, this emaciated woman in rags suffering from withdrawal and malnutrition. When they learned she had been the Empress of Manchukuo, she became a prisoner. But the communists had no facilities prepared for someone in her condition. She was moved from place to place, her health deteriorating rapidly. Without opium, she went through agonizing withdrawal. Without proper food or medical care, her body began to shut down. On June 20th, 1946, in a prison in Yanji in northeastern China, Wan Rong died. She was just 40 years old. Her body was thrown into an unmarked grave. The woman who had been Empress of China, who had lived in unimaginable luxury in the Forbidden City, who had been chosen for her beauty and breeding, died alone and forgotten in a prison cell. She never knew what became of Puyi. He survived his imprisonment, was re-educated by the communist government, and was released in 1959. He lived quietly in Beijing, working as a gardener and later as an editor. He remarried to a woman named Li Shuxian, and in his final years, he found a measure of peace and normalcy that had eluded him his entire life. He wrote his autobiography, which became a bestseller and was later adapted into the film The Last Emperor. He died in 1967, having outlived Wan Rong by more than 20 years. In his memoir, He expressed regret for how he had treated Wan Rong. He acknowledged that his selfishness and cruelty had destroyed her. But these words came too late, written decades after her death. When she had needed his protection, his love, his basic human decency, he had given her nothing but coldness and punishment. The story of Yi and Wan Rong is often romanticized as a tragic love story. But in truth, it was hardly a love story at all. It was the story of two people trapped by history, by tradition, by circumstances beyond their control. Whatever affection had existed between them in those early days in the Forbidden City couldn't survive the weight of their impossible situation. Wan Rong was a victim on every level. She was a victim of the imperial system that treated women as property. She was a victim of Yi's selfishness and emotional cruelty. She was a victim of Japanese imperialism that used both her and her husband as puppets. She was a victim of the chaos of Chinese history in the 20th century. And ultimately, she was a victim of a man who had been raised to believe he was a god and never learned to see the humanity in others or in himself. If there is a love story here, it's a story of love perverted and destroyed by power, tradition, and the collision between ancient China and the modern world. Wan Rong loved the idea of what her life might be, loved the brief moments of freedom she experienced, perhaps even loved the shy young emperor she first met in the Forbidden City. But that young man became a collaborator and a tyrant who prioritized his empty title over the woman who shared his fate. Today, when tourists visit the Forbidden City, they walk through the halls where Wan Rong once played the piano, where she first met her husband, where she spent the early years of her marriage. The palace has been preserved as a museum, a monument to a vanished way of life. But there is little there to commemorate Wan Rong herself. Her story has been overshadowed by Yi's, reduced to a footnote in his dramatic life story. Yet her story deserves to be told and remembered. She represents countless women throughout history who were trapped by circumstances they didn't choose, who suffered for the ambitions and failures of the men around them. Her beauty, her education, her potential, all of it was wasted, destroyed by a system that saw her only as a means to produce an heir and enhance a man's status. The last Empress of China died in a prison cell, addicted, sick, separated from her child, abandoned by the man she had been forced to marry. There was no dignity in her death, no final ceremony, no mourning period. She simply ceased to exist, and the world moved on without her. It's an ending almost too cruel to contemplate, and yet it's the truth of what happened to this woman who once seemed to have everything. In the end, the Forbidden City that had been both palace and prison to Wan Rong stands as a monument to the dynasty that fell. The vermilion walls still rise against the Beijing sky. The courtyards where she walked are now filled with tourists taking photographs. The halls where she played piano echo with the voices of guides explaining the history of the Qing Dynasty. But somewhere in those halls, if you listen carefully, perhaps you can still hear the faint sound of a young woman's laughter from those early days, before everything went wrong. The sound of a teenage bride who still had hope, who believed her life might be something beautiful. That laughter faded quickly, drowned out by disappointment, addiction, loss, and ultimately death. This is the true story of the last emperor and the last empress of China. Not a fairy tale, not a romance, but a tragedy that illuminates the human cost of living at the intersection of history's great transformations. Wan Rong deserved better than the life she got, better than the death she suffered. Her story is a reminder that behind every historical event, every political transformation, there are individual human beings whose suffering is real and whose stories matter. The Forbidden City remains. The empire is gone. And Wan Rong, the beautiful, educated young woman who became its last empress, rests in an unmarked grave somewhere in northeastern China, remembered now only as a cautionary tale about the price of being chosen for greatness in a world that was falling apart.